In 1663, Charles II gave Rhode Island a charter permitting the state to hold forth a lively experiment that a most flourishing civil state may stand and best be maintained with a full liberty in religious concernments. This was the fruit of nearly 3 decades of struggle by Roger Williams, a state in which you could enjoy liberty in religion provided you did not disturb the civil peace. What led to that charter of 1663? A number of writers in recent years, Christian and otherwise, have looked at Roger Williams in the light of the current collapse of so-called Christian culture in the West. Os Guinness has drawn on him in 2 books at least. Theologian Miroslav Volf devotes a section to him in his 2015 book Flourishing. And more recently, Professor Teresa Bijan of Oxford has compared Williams with Thomas Hobbes and John Locke in search of a basis for civility in society, and prefers Williams for what she calls his unapologetically cacophonous and evangelical approach to toleration. Now, what is his attraction for such thinkers? I suggest it is, in Bijan's words, that he sets the bar low. He had to start from scratch. In the West, we perhaps feel we're having to do something similar. Christians and others are asking, what is the bond of society? What holds a society together? What are its basic building blocks? Are we distinguishing carefully enough between the fruit of a civilization and its roots? In particular, does a society need Christianity or religion at all as its bond? Are we prepared to aim and not just put up with something much less than what we call our Judeo-Christian culture? I'm not going to give much biography of Williams. There's a very good book you can buy which will do that for you. I shall select 7 principles, though, that I see as central in his thinking, and I'll try to illustrate those from his life and history. And the first is liberty of conscience. We obviously begin there. But by the way, the first 2 will probably be the longest, so if we're getting on a bit and you're worried where are the other 5, the first 2 points are probably the longest. Liberty of conscience. In the summer of 1630, John Winthrop, in the Arbella with sister ships carrying about 350 people, arrived in Massachusetts. Between 15 and 20,000 would make that journey during the 1630s. Winthrop and co. soon made Boston their base. This is about 40 miles north of the Mayflower Pilgrim settlement in Plymouth, and flourished much faster. While the Plymouth settlers were separatists in their religion, the Massachusetts Bay Company leaders expressed their loyalty to the mother church in England, but it would soon become clear that they had their own ideas of what they wanted their church to be. Roger Williams was not far behind Winthrop, arriving with his wife in February 1631. His wife, by the way, was the daughter of Richard Bernard, a Puritan clergyman, his wife Mary. John Winthrop noted that Mr. Williams, a godly minister, was on board the Lion, Lyon, ship. An opportunity for Williams to serve the new settlement arose very quickly. The minister of the Boston Church was returning to England and would be away for many months. Williams was invited to take the position of teacher in the church. For Williams, no more than 28 at the time, and possibly younger, this was a wonderful opportunity. Yet he declined. I durst not officiate to an unseparated people, he later explained in a letter to John Cotton Jr. He could not bring himself to join in worship or lead worship with a congregation who had not renounced fellowship with the impurity of the Church of England. In a later recollection of a meeting in July 1629, while he was still in England, in Essex, working as a chaplain in a Puritan household, meeting with Thomas Hooker and John Cotton, that's John Cotton Sr., he wrote that he remembered challenging the senior clergymen on their use of the Book of Common Prayer. He durst not join with them in their use of common prayer, he wrote. That durst not again. For William's conscience was a serious matter. I think I meant John Winthrop Jr. he wrote his letter to, not John Cotton Jr. However. Now, from Boston then, Williams went to the more separatist Salem as teacher. Boston objected. On what basis they did that is debatable, but they did. Williams went to Plymouth and went back to Salem again, and further storms arose. In October 1635, he's been in New England about 4 years now, he was charged before the court in Boston of proclaiming 4 offensive views. Number 1, the royal patent was not valid as the king had no right to give away Indians' land. Secondly, settlers should not worship in Church of England churches on return to England. Thirdly, that a wicked person or unbeliever should not be called upon to take an oath, as it was a form of worship. And fourthly, that the civil magistrate's power extended to the bodies and goods, but not the souls of men and women. And that's crucial. This fourth point, forbidding magistrates to exercise jurisdiction over the first table of the Ten Commandments, and therefore a person's religion, was the nub of Williams's great battle with Massachusetts and his establishing of Rhode Island. Williams was exiled from Massachusetts and eventually ordered to be repatriated, but John Winthrop tipped him off, and Williams fled and settled after 14 weeks in the New England winter at what became Providence in Rhode Island. His wife, you can do the journey in about an hour and a half, by the way, now, but it took 14 weeks in the forests. His wife and children followed, as did a number of other Salem refugees from the government of the Boston Puritans. After 1636 and his arrival in Providence, Williams jointly founded, then soon left, the First Baptist Church in America. I just say that because this is a Baptist conference. I'll say why he left it after 3 months and never was a church member again a little later on. You don't get your ecclesiology from Roger Williams. I'm not going to pretend that you do. But more than anything, Williams devoted his life to establishing a state as a shelter for persons distressed for conscience. Ola Winslow, the American historian, comments, stronger than any other principle underneath the structure of early Providence government was the hatred of oppression and the militant resentment of meddling with personal freedom in any form. However difficult it was in practice to attain, 3 principles guided Williams: liberty of conscience, separation of church and state, and government by the people, not by an oligarchy. In 1640, the town of Providence entered into a founding constitution that is remarkable, says historian John Barry, in 2 respects. First, obedience was promised in civil things only. Second, there was no mention of God. John Barry calls this extraordinary, pointing out that all comparable founding documents began with explicit recognition of God, such as, for example, Plymouth's Mayflower Compact, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, and so forth. Nothing like that at Providence. And it wasn't because Williams was an atheist or agnostic. We'll see that. In 1642, Williams determined that a charter was needed for the establishment and survival of his colony. He made a voyage to England, where he stayed till 1644, and in March 1644, the charter was granted by a parliamentary committee. 19 years later, as I said at the beginning, it was confirmed as a royal charter by Charles, but here this was granted by a parliamentary committee during the Civil War, of course. The residents of Rhode Island, who were variously by New Englanders called scum and riffraff, their colony a sewer and a latrina, sometimes Rogues Island, were addressed by Parliament as our well-affected and industrious English. And the combination of Providence, Portsmouth and Newport were named Providence Plantations in the Narragansett Bay. In 1662, the name officially became Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. It's now, as then, the smallest state with the longest name. By allowing the greater part of the inhabitants to establish laws, the 1644 Charter made this an explicitly democratic government. Decisions about religion were left to the majority, knowing that Rhode Islanders wanted to leave issues of religion out of the state's reach. Williams had succeeded. Providence Plantations exceeded any other known state in the world in its freedom, says John Barry. Teresa Bijan says, Williams' achievement was remarkable. Rhode Island was for over a century the most tolerant society on earth. Now we come to the Bloody Tenant. While in London, Williams also arranged for the publication of 5 books, including his greatest work, The Bloody Tenant, which we would say the bloodthirsty tenet, or principle, that's what it really means. Tenant, it seems to be an old way of spelling that. The bloodthirsty tenet of persecution for cause of conscience discussed. And arguments for soul freedom that buzzed like bees in Williams's bonnet all his life are here given their fullest expression. The first half of the book is really a reply to John Cotton, whose idea of liberty of conscience was basically that if you offended against orthodoxy, you were offending against conscience and should be punished by the church and thereafter, if need be, by the state. The truth is so clear, said Cotton, and many like him, that anyone who offended against it was not obeying conscience, but offending against it. The consequence was that, in effect, only Orthodox Puritans could be said to obey conscience. If you were unrepentantly wrong in their eyes, you could not be being conscientious. For Williams, on the other hand, you must not go against what you believe. Conscience was to do with the mind, not just the will. I'll summarise Williams' arguments for liberty of conscience. You'll find something similar in the current edition of Reformation Today, but I'll just go through some of them. They're not, they were similar things to what were heard elsewhere at the time, but what I would say is this: his arguments were this, that God alone is Lord of the conscience. No civil magistrate, no king, no Caesar have any power, he writes, over the souls and consciences of their subjects in the matters of God and the crown of Jesus. Secondly, coercion does not work anyway. He was quite pragmatic, as conscience is subject only to the rules of understanding, which effect change by reason, argument, and persuasion. The Bible, after all, only gives us the word of the Spirit as our sword. Thirdly, coercion creates hypocrites. You get people who will say they believe just to avoid persecution. Fourthly, coercion confirms people in their erroneous convictions. If you make people suffer for their beliefs, they're more likely to believe it more strongly. Coercion will eventually, he says, turn against the true church. What Williams is most famous for is the breadth of his vision of liberty of conscience. An early biographer, James D. Knowles, concluded, Roger Williams is entitled to the honour of being the first writer in modern times who clearly maintained the absolute right of every man to a full liberty in religious concernments. Though we should credit and honour Thomas Helwys for actually making the claim in his 1612 book, The Mystery of Iniquity, but it was Williams who took it and ran with it. It looks as if Williams was influenced by Helwys and other General Baptists at that time, although he doesn't particularly deliberately credit people. But it is Williams certainly who ran with it and fought for it from the 1630s onwards. The Puritans in England sought liberty for themselves, said Francis Wayland, president of Brown University in Providence in 1860. Roger Williams sought liberty for humanity. Rights for one must be rights for all. The conscience of every human being is inviolable. An unbeliever shouldn't be required to take an oath. Why should school days, council meetings, the opening of Parliament, or the coronation of a monarch be marked by Christian prayers? The vast majority of people who live under these institutions are indifferent or hostile to the Christian religion. What is Christian about such events? Is our Judeo-Christian culture more Judeo than Christian? Why do we always say Judeo-Christian? Isn't Christian enough? If something's Christian, aren't you just reducing it by saying Judeo-Christian? Do we not reduce something by qualifying it? So, are we simply really playing the national church game? So, liberty of conscience doesn't come alone. I'm already bleeding into my second point, the second principle that Williams fought for: separation of church and state. Inseparable from liberty of conscience for Williams was the separation of church and state. The New England from which he had been exiled insisted that only church members could participate in public and political life, that's to be freedmen. Church and state were certainly in principle separate. Indeed, they were more separate than they would have been elsewhere anyway in old Europe. That's true. But church and state obviously shared the same goals, and ministers were highly influential in civil affairs. Civil and church bodies were deeply intertwined. Magistrates, civil officers, tried heretics, like Anne Hutchinson, for example, who, when exiled from Boston in 1637, went to live in Rhode Island. Doesn't mean to say Williams agreed with her views, but she was free to go and live in Rhode Island. She wasn't free to live in New England, in Massachusetts. And Williams argued, rightly, that where church and state are so interlinked, then excommunication from the church is bound to entail exile from the state, as it had for him and a number of others already by the late 1630s. Let me summarise his arguments for separation of church and state, which comprise the second part of the bloody tenet. Firstly, God has, since the coming of Christ, permitted complete freedom of conscience. And listen how shocking this is. God has, since the coming of Christ, permitted complete freedom of conscience and worship be granted to all men in all nations and countries, and idolatry and unbelief are only to be fought against with the sword of the Spirit, the word of God. Now, by permitted, he doesn't mean God approves of idolatry and unbelief, but he is saying God does not deal with it or expect the state to deal with it as it was in ancient Israel. Second point, although government is an ordinance of God, all civil states are essentially civil and are not competent in spiritual matters. The state's authority derives from people, and the church must not be placed under the world. Yes, he recognized government is given by God, Romans 13, but he was of the view, which is again replicated in other 17th century writers, that it's through God, through the people, authorizes governments to act. And you can't put the church under the state if people are running the state. Union of church and state, he said, will lead to the church becoming a wilderness. We'll return to that image. Fourthly, the state of Israel is figurative and no authoritative pattern or precedent for any kingdom in the world to follow. Now, what he's saying is that Israel was unique. All the arguments that you read from Winthrop and those that they seeing England and New England in terms of ancient Israel, and so government is therefore to be, it's a theocracy, a kind of theocracy. How you exactly define theocracy varies, but it was a kind of seeing the state having authority in religious matters. And time and again, Williams would come back to this. No, you can't use Israel as a model for contemporary nations. Then, fifthly, spiritual gifts, offices and weapons are sufficient to deal with spiritual enemies and problems. The church does not need the state either to establish or preserve churches. Sixthly, true civility and Christianity may flourish in a state, notwithstanding the permission of diverse and contrary consciences. And he was fond of using the example of Holland, or the Netherlands as we're supposed to call it today, as an example at the time. He insisted, though, that civil duties of obedience and participation remain. And then, on final point, he made the point that restriction of public service to church members or professing Christians greatly deprives the state of useful and gifted servants. As we know, we're always relying on non-Christians doing all sorts of things for us. So one illustration that Williams used to describe the place of the church in relation to the state is that of an association, for example, of physicians, or it could be anyone, but he uses physicians, doctors, within a city, and this association may meet, discuss, keep records, split up, and yet not affect the peace of the city at all. That was how he sees the church in a city. In 1655, he wrote a letter to the town of Providence, and he used another metaphor, the ship of state. This is quite famous. At that time, certain residents in Providence, quite possibly Quakers, were objecting to compulsory military service that Williams and others saw as necessary to the welfare of the state. So in civil things, he didn't mind going against people's... He said, okay, we need some military service, to protect the state. Right? Objecting to compulsory military service that Williams saw necessary to the welfare of the state. Liberty of conscience, he reminded them, was not infinite, and he'd never said it was. I'll quote a bit of his letter. There goes many a ship to sea, with many hundreds of souls in one ship, whose weal and woe is common and a true picture of a commonwealth, or a human combination or society. I affirm that all the liberty of conscience I ever pleaded for turns upon these two hinges, that none of the papists, Protestants, Jews, or Turks be forced to come to the ship's prayers or worship, nor compelled from their own particular prayers or worship, if they practice any. But then he goes on to add at length that all the passengers and the crew must play their part in the safe sailing of the ship, and not mutiny against the captain. In other words, you must be good citizens. Now, the Bloody Tenant survived a hostile reception. Published in July 1644, it was ordered by Parliament to be burned in August, and the licensor was rebuked for letting it through. This by the Puritans, who 10 years earlier had lost their ears to fight for their own particular liberties. By then, though, Williams was on board ship back to England with his charter in his bag, so he'd been quite clever. He left just in time before the storm broke. Now, Williams's reasoning on church-state separation was primarily for the welfare of the church. Christians who want Christianity to be influential in society sometimes forget at what cost to its purity this can be bought. During a long chain of correspondence with John Cotton, Williams used a metaphor that was to become famous. That when they have opened a gap in the hedge or wall of separation, he said, between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, God hath ever broken down the wall itself, removed the candlestick, and made his garden a wilderness, as at this day. Now, of course, that phrase, wall of separation, has become famous or infamous as used by Thomas Jefferson in a letter in 1802 to Baptists in Connecticut. There's no evidence of any dependence on Williams, but it's possible that he got it indirectly, because Williams's works were being published by men like Isaac Backus at the time, and Jefferson might have picked it up, but we don't know. So this wall of separation, he says, but once you break that down, it's the church that suffers. Miroslav Volf argues that Williams, though a strong religious exclusivist, became one of the main progenitors of political pluralism. So you see, religious exclusivism, political pluralism. Williams reminds us that while in a minority, which is the position most Christians in history have found themselves, Christians can live Christianly without Christendom. To render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to the God the things that are God's, and to bring in the kingdom that is not of this world, do not require a Christian culture, even if such a society is the best place to live. We will do what good we can in politics and society, including fighting for the benefits of a Christian worldview and ethics, but Christians should primarily be working for the coming of Christ's kingdom, not focusing on preserving or retrieving a so-called Christian culture. In a letter to John Winthrop Jr. during the Indian War in 1675, sometimes called King Philip's War, wasn't it? Williams wrote, this is towards the end of his life, of course, "Why is our candle burning? Why are we still alive? But to glorify our dreadful former," by which he means our awesome creator, God, "and in making our calling and election sure, and serving God in serving the public in our generation." I find that quite moving, and I find it very challenging. He wasn't just serving under the church, you see. He saw it as part of his Christian duty to glorify God, to serve the public. And he could be involved in politics and be involved in the wider world. He wasn't a man who withdrew from the wider world. That willingness to serve God by serving the public sums up much that was central to Williams. He wanted to separate from spiritual impurity, but not from people. He saw more danger in the impure church, above all in Christendom, than in wholehearted engagement with the world, even the dirty world of politics and war. I was reading something. I was reading shall I be ashamed to say? I was reading a novel on the train up this morning, and one of the characters in the novel said that that atheist humanism is the only basis of a pluralist society. It was a fun novel. that atheist humanism is the only basis of a pluralist society. Williams would say no. You can have a pluralist society with a profoundly Christian base. So do we work at political pluralism, which entails inclusivism politically alongside religious exclusivism, separatism in terms of church, not separate from each other, separate from the world, in terms of church, engagement in terms of society? Do we have a theology of separatist engagement? Third point, after liberty of conscience, separation of church and state, respect. Williams reminds us how to live together. His profound respect for human beings as creatures of God and answerable to God first and last is the essential to civil society. It was at Plymouth that Williams first made substantial contact with Native Americans. Williams was never romantic about them. He later referred to his dislike of their filthy, smoky holes and once referred to them as wolves with men's minds. But he achieved a level of mutual trust and, believe it or not, respect with them, and a knowledge of their language that was not only unique among the English, but was, in just a few years, and on many occasions, to be the means of averting bloodshed between the races. He had a particularly warm relationship with an old Narragansett, they were a tribe in the Rhode Island area, chief called Canonicus. And who, he said, regarded him as a son till his dying day. And Canonicus and his nephew Miantonomu used to turn up and borrow things from Williams without he used to lose lots of stuff, but he didn't mind. He was happy to develop the friendship. Williams's first book, published in 1643 in England, was an anthropological and linguistic manual entitled A Key into the Language of America, or, this is typical 17th century, An Help to the Language of the Natives in that part of America called New England, together with brief observations of the customs, manners and worships, etc., of the aforesaid natives in peace and war, life and death. He had a deep empathy with the native humanity around him. Sometimes, as in The Key, he contrasted them to the disadvantage of the English. If nature's sons, both wild and tame, humane and courteous be, how ill becomes its sons of God to want humanity? And he's referring back to the fact that New England had kicked him out, he'd spent 14 weeks in the wilderness. And Indians, like the Wampanoags in the Plymouth area, had actually looked after him quite a lot while he was travelling through the forest and the snow before he got to Providence. The subtitle of the book tells us there's a guide to the language of the natives of New England. It's an observation on their customs, manners, and worship. And when you read it, it's rather like a travel guide. It has all these different aspects of life and food and clothing and religion and the various vocabulary. So it's like reading, when you go to Spain, you buy your first phrase book and how I work through it. It's a bit like that. But it also has the observations on their spiritual life and their beliefs in God and so forth. He said his contents were dearly bought in some few years' hardship among the barbarians. He expresses the wish, he says, that a man may hope by this help converse with thousands of natives all over the country, and by such converse it may please the Father of mercies to spread civility and in his own most holy season Christianity. For one candle will light 10,000, and it may please God to bless a little leaven to season the mighty lump of those people and territories. In other words, he hopes the book is going to help with the spread of the gospel. And to want to convert people is not to disrespect them. It's interesting. There is the view these days that if you seek to convert someone, you are showing disrespect for them. No, you believe people as they are. That's respect. No, we say we love them. Yes, we respect them, but they're sinners who need the gospel. So we're challenges we're faced with today. Williams is keen to point out at any opportunity that as human beings, the Native Americans are every bit as good as the Europeans. The English might well find heaven open to Indians wild, but shut to thee, he says. And this book and another later book, His Christenings Make Not Christians, which the title tells everything, are at least as much about the need for Christendom to be converted as for the Indians to be converted. And that's a very profound point. He's always talking about the unchristian, or in different ways, the unchristianity of Christendom. I think there's struggle today to ground respect for human beings, which is inseparable from freedom of conscience and worship, without the biblical doctrine of the image of God. Something has to be given, there has to be a non-negotiable in which we start. And this is where Williams was able to begin, of course. Fourth point, persuasion. Persuasion. Williams was a great negotiator. How good are we at discussion, debating, arguing with people we do not agree with? Douglas Murray, in his recent book, The Madness of Crowds, points out that while social media does not necessarily cause arguments, sometimes it does actually, it makes it a lot harder to solve them, for we just shout at each other from different corners of the world, virtually anonymously making the worst of each other's cases. Face-to-face encounters, says Murray, can do a lot of good. Well, Williams believed in that. He was an inveterate discusser. The man who could be so prickly when claiming religious freedoms in Massachusetts, and whom John Quincy Adams, a later president, called a polemical porcupine, had a great gift of negotiation and mediation. He was useful to Massachusetts time and again as a negotiator with Native Americans. In 1636, months after they'd sent him out, they were using him as a negotiator. Williams' achievement was to prevent a potentially disastrous alliance of two tribes, the Narragansetts and the Pequots. At Boston's request, this useful exile rushed to the Narragansett chief's house in what he says a poor canoe, cutting through, quotes, a stormy wind, 30 mile in great seas every minute in hazard of life. He wasn't one to minimise his difficulties, Williams. And then lodging with, quotes, the bloody Pequot ambassadors, whose hands and arms, methought, reeked with blood of my countrymen, murdered and massacred by them at Connecticut River, and from whom I could not but nightly look for their bloody knives at my own throat also. You think of Hawkeye, right? This man was there before it. I mean, you have to admire the courage of the guy. In 1672, he had a tougher job, if anything, with the Pequots because he was debating with Quakers. And from the late 1650s, Rhode Island attracted Quakers. People were being bitten, he said, by the infectious teeth. Roger Williams challenged them to a debate, and he set out 40 propositions to be discussed, and the debate took over 3 days in August 1672 and a 4th day in Providence, so it was 4 days. And he panelled himself at the age of 69, 20 or 30 miles along in Narragansett Bay again. He was 69, he was ill, and it's the same, really. It's similar to the Pequot, but he was only 33 then. This is 36 years later. Why did he do this? Why this debate? Was his enthusiasm for freedom of conscience cooling off? No. No Quaker was ever arrested, fined, whipped, or hanged for their beliefs in Rhode Island. Don't forget, Mary Dyer, the wife of a former Attorney General in Rhode Island, William Dyer, was hanged with 4 Quaker men in Boston in 1659. By 1661, the Quakers were already holding annual meetings in Rhode Island. In 1672, a Quaker was elected governor. There was a huge difference of atmosphere. They were never banished or prevented from entering the colony. Williams insisted on their right to live there, but he didn't agree with their beliefs. Truthfully, he was actually afraid of their beliefs. His commitment to liberty of conscience was not out of indifference to the truth, but out of passion for it. Teresa Bijan argues that his determination to tolerate the Quakers in Rhode Island, despite his personal contempt for them, should be seen as a powerful illustration of what true toleration, as the willingness to coexist with those people and views one finds most contemptible, really looks like. Now, I don't actually think she's right in saying that Williams found them personally contemptible. I think she's mistaken. He held their views contemptible. I think it would be a mistake to say he would necessarily find them contemptible, but she's slightly over-egging the custard, as they say on the news. Now, Os Guinness brings Williams to bear on the first challenge he sees as confronting Americans today of living with one another's deepest differences. Truth and tough-minded debates about truth, writes Guinness, are the oxygen of a free society. He argues that today, however, the language of protest, pronouncement, and proclamation has almost completely replaced the language of persuasion. Language has itself become an exercise of power. We might add intimidation, not of reason, persuasion. Victory depends on making the winning statement, not recognizing the truth. Williams, like his friend John Milton, was convinced that the liberty of ideas and debate was for the benefit of the gospel, that the word of the Lord should be able to run freely. But this means other ideas have to be free to run too, however uncomfortable that is. Persuasion, then. Fifthly, civility, keeping the bar low. Can society survive without a religious foundation? Typical of the thinking of the Puritan age was the expression of a Massachusetts document in 1635 entitled A Model of Church and Civil Power. This is that civil peace cannot stand entire where religion is corrupted. Right? Civil peace cannot stand entire where religion is corrupted. True religion was adjudged to be essential to the stability of the state. Roger Williams created in Rhode Island what we would call a pluralist society. People of all beliefs and none were welcome to settle there and worship and indeed live as they wish, provided they abided by mutually agreed norms of behaviour that preserved civil peace. The problem with pluralism, however, is always this. On what moral basis does society build? And does society need a common religious foundation? Roger Williams is quite content to say no. There was a civil faithfulness, obedience, honesty, chastity, he said, that existed even amongst such as own not God nor Christ. He believed that God's absolute moral law was embedded in every human being, was reflected in conscience, in the image of God, which had been shattered but not destroyed completely by the fall. He was firmly within what is traditionally called the natural law tradition. The teaching not only is God's law written in the human heart at creation and never completely erased, but that the law is adequate to ground civil society. And the concept Williams was fond of using to describe the pattern of life in a pluralist society was civility. Murder, adultery, theft, and lying were laws written in men's hearts. He would add the golden rule, do as you would be done by. This becomes give every man his due, a natural law principle of justice, which of course entails toleration. Now, of course, there's a whole load of different scope for argument here. Other virtues Williams would have said were what we call sociableness, helpfulness, friendliness, to live as neighbours, loyalty, dependability, respect for civil authority, and gratitude. Any coercion of conscience was persecution. And the shared norms and values of civility are for Williams the foundation of durable public order. Don't forget what he was trying to do. The enormity of what he was trying to do is trying to build a society here where you had all kinds of peculiar people, sectarians and Quakers coming in, different views. People, Anne Hutchinson, with a kind of mystical antinomianism, and people who are atheists and so forth. And he's trying to weld together a society out of this. He also said it was the duty of government to allow freedom of worship, and that's about as far as duty of government went, really, in terms of religion. But because such freedom is crucial to preserving an environment where civility could flourish. Nor should even a moral code be established in detail, but moral freedom be nurtured. Governments had to make laws and punishments as fitted their case. Williams knew that morality could not be coerced any more than religion. He knew, too, that godliness, which is infinitely more beautiful, could be wanting in a person. There could still be moral goodness. So you can have moral goodness without godliness. And he believed that the common good of civil society depends more on the cultivation of civility than on uniformity of religion. Religion's contribution should be in cultivating a desire and capacity for civility, for living together in peace. Well, Teresa Bijan examines the civility crisis in public life today in her book Mere Civility, published a couple of years ago. What, she asks, can provide the bond of society now that the hitherto presupposed glue of true religion and Christian charity is being dissolved? We must find a way of tolerating the intolerant. If we do not, the church itself will be a victim of intolerance, because we are the first to be called intolerant, and of governmental intolerance as well. More is needed, she says, than superficial calls for politeness if we were to avoid, on the one hand, a collapse into violent and chaotic discourse, or on the other, retreat into our own echo chambers where we refuse to hear anyone we fear will offend us or others. She discusses and rejects Hobbes and Locke. She prefers what she calls William's mere civility because it sets the bar of the bond of society lower and embraces everyone. His version of civility, she says, required less like-mindedness, more real tolerance. Okay? So tolerance, not like-mindedness. They're different. By mere civility, she means, quotes, a low standard, loosely applied, combined with a thick-skinned determination to tolerate what we perceive as others' incivility. William's crucial contribution, concludes Bijan, was the insight that the common ground needed to sustain a tolerant society could be much more minimal and superficial than traditionalist defenders of religion as the bond of society supposed. Williams was under no illusion that such a place would be a peaceful, harmonious, or pleasant place to live, but in a society committed to toleration of diversity and disagreement, in quotes, she uses language, the messy real world of unmurderous coexistence between individuals divided on the fundamentals and mutually disdainful of others, okay? The messy real world of unmurderous coexistence between individuals divided on the fundamentals and mutually disdainful of others. Mere civility offers the modest hope of living with those whom one finds difficult to respect. This unapologetically evangelical form of toleration has, she says, fundamentally shaped our, American, she means, institutional intellectual context. She then suggests, intriguingly, that evangelism, as a model of conversational engagement, seems uniquely well-suited to characterize and sustain a commitment to ongoing active and often heated disagreement in the public square. So she's saying, allow evangelism. Evangelism is the best test of civility, the best test of toleration, without agreement. Okay? William said, he that is a briar, that is a Jew, a Turk, a pagan, or an anti-Christian, by which he meant Roman Catholic, not atheist, today may be, when the word of the Lord runs freely, a member of Jesus Christ tomorrow. What enabled Williams to be so robust? Well, what enabled him to be so robust was that the bond of society of Williams was the created order. For Winthrop and proponents of Christendom, it's the gospel. And society, therefore, begins to take on more the appearance of a church. Essentially, you can look at New England and say they're trying to run it like a church, really, and that all his City on a Hill speech to the New England, to the people as they went over in 1630, it was great sermon, but what happens when you get lots of unbelievers there? If you respect people for Williams, you respect them because that person is a creature of God, and humanity is fallen, so needs to hear the truth. Williams had great respect and love for the truth. Having bought truth dear, he said, we must not sell it cheap, no, not for the saving of souls, they're our own most precious. Note that, having bought truth dear, we must not sell it cheap, no, not for the saving of souls. You don't twist the truth in the cause of winning souls. Right, sixth point, tenderness. I'm really cheating here. I'm just bringing this in because I want to talk about the book that he wrote. Okay, so tenderness is the sixth point. Baptists were being persecuted in Boston in 1651. Obadiah Holmes whipped within an inch of his life in 1652. Williams went with his Baptist colleague John Clark to London again. Williams stayed till 1654, went home. Clark stayed in London. It was he who eventually obtained the charter from Charles II. Eventually Williams had gone back. And again, Williams published 5 books, and the most delightful is one he'd written for his wife while away from her at his trading post in Rhode Island, where he made his living. He was a trader. His 3 brothers were traders. His father was a merchant tailor, which meant he traded cloth. He was brought up in East London, and so trading was natural to the family, and he made his money trading. And this little book that he wrote for his wife was called Experiments of Spiritual Life and Health, or Experiments of Spiritual Life and Health and Their Preservatives, in which the weakest child of God may get assurance of his spiritual life and blessedness, and the strongest may find proportionable discoveries of his Christian growth and the means of it. Now, this is Williams at his most conventionally Puritan. It is organised under 3 heads. Under the first, he asks, what are the evidences of true spiritual life? My dearest love and companion in this vale of tears, he writes. He writes to his wife. He was away from her. He was trading. She was ill at home. So he writes this book. Mary's late illness and speedy raising, he says, should be taken as a warning from heaven to make ready for a sudden call to be gone from thence, to live the rest of our short uncertain span more as strangers, longing and breathing after another home and country. My dear love, he continues, he cannot be with her as much as he would like, so he will send her something sweeter than honey and the honeycomb, the spiritual posy to help her. Now, when did you last write your wife a spiritual posy? We all have our phones on tonight, and we'll have maybe Skype or FaceTime. We'll write her a book. His second head is about how one may tell the strength and vigour of one's spiritual life, and his third is the means of recovering and preserving spiritual strength. I just love this. There's a gentleness about Williams in all of this struggle. He's fighting with these people, these really difficult people. If you read the book, you'll see really awkward people he had to cope with. And he has this tender, really compassion and concern for his wife's spiritual welfare. One evidence of spiritual strength, that he says, is when we have a vehement longing after Christ's invisible open profession of holy worship and ordinances. In other words, we long to be in the fellowship of the church. And we see how painful it was for Williams to believe that the true church no longer existed. You think, what? Well, it was not that he despised the church, and if we think that Williams turned away from the church because of non-theological reasons or indifference to it, that wasn't so. But he met with little groups of believers. There are records of his preaching. He sent a book of sermons to be published by Mostyn. They didn't publish it. But these groups of believers were a poor substitute for the true church, with its ordinances, worship, and preaching. And the abiding paradox of Williams's life was his longing for the community of the church and her ordinances, yet believing it was not to be found on earth in his time, and he wouldn't settle for anything he considered a poor imitation. It's complex to go into it. It basically boils down to the fact that his interpretation of Revelation. And there were a lot of Puritans who had peculiar interpretations of Revelation and the eschatologies. He was certainly at the end of the spectrum, probably. Nonetheless, he wasn't completely off the radar. But what he believed is that the white horsemen in Revelation 6 and 19 were the Christ and his apostles. We don't hear anything of them between chapter 6 and 19. And where we are is somewhere in Revelation chapter 11. The accession of Constantine put an end to the pure church, and they're still in the medieval wilderness. Okay? Now then, there were those who would have said that those who would have agreed very much with Williams, but they would have said that from Calvin, Luther onwards, the Reformation began. This was the resurrection of the two witnesses, right? That's why I asked for Revelation 11 to be read. William still believed that time for the death and resurrection of those two witnesses hadn't yet happened. He was a witness in sackcloth, right? He wasn't an apostle. He was a witness in sackcloth, and his task was to not to found churches, but to witness against Antichrist and call people to repentance. It's a very difficult theology for us to get our head around in our day and age, because we know we're so good at eschatology. And we understand Revelation so well. But his understanding, they were in this period where they had no apostolic authority to found churches. You just had to witness against Antichrist. And so you couldn't have a proper church. So don't blame Williams for being untheological. He was theological. It was just a rather, we might say, strange theology and exegesis that led him to that. But he wasn't, so far off the radar. Right. But that's why, and this comes through in this lovely book that he wrote, the longing for the church, longing for that time when Christ would come and establish the true church again. What kept Williams apart from mystics like Anne Hutchinson was that Williams had a very strong sense of the Bible as the Word of God. He had no truck with the mysticism, for example, of the Quakers. One of his strongest attacks of the Quakers was that you say you're Christ, you think you're Christ, you think you've got the Holy Spirit. And their contempt for the Bible as the written Word of God angered him no end. He kept going on at them about that. And it kept, I think, Williams from some of the greater excesses of some of the sectarians that were going on at that time. My last point, being adventurous. Williams was adventurous in his thinking. He was a pioneer on the American frontier. And I think that's it's a picture, and that's how he was. He was there in Rhode Island, living amongst the Native Americans at the time. He tried debating, discussing with them. He tried to avert King Philip's war. He failed. There was a terrible war. But if that had happened 30 years earlier, when he hadn't been able to negotiate peace, the England could have been wiped out. They'd have been wiped off the face of New England. And so he was there here in New England. And it's not for nothing that he has a statue at the Reformation Wall in Geneva. A lot of people have never heard of Roger Williams, but he's one of 6 political Calvinist heroes along the Reformation Wall with the 4 great reformers there. He wrote once to Governor Endicott of Massachusetts after the persecution of the Baptists in 1651. He says, "We live in wonderful, searching, disputing, and dissenting times." That's a positive approach, isn't it? Endicott was saying that the trash deserved death, the Baptists. Right? John Cotton had preached that infant baptism should be a capital offence. Opposing infant baptism should be a capital offence. So he says, we live in these wonderful, searching, disputing, and dissenting times. Now, by wonderful, he doesn't mean wonderful in a Disney sense, but something like strange and astonishing times. We are at wonderful times. These are things that make us wonder what's going on. They were not comfortable days, and Williams struggled all his life to make his vision work. But serving God in service to the public, he persevered, not just for himself, or for those whom he found congenial. Believers or unbelievers, but for everyone. And yet in the end, he would say that the purity of the church was his priority and his great longing. I think we're living in wonderful, searching, dissenting, and disputing times, aren't we? But how do we approach it? I think Williams helps us. I've tried to point a number of ways: liberty of conscience, and separation of church and state, and respect, and persuasion, civility. I think just to sum up two ways. We're in an age when I think Christians do need to recover clarity about our aims and expectations in relation to culture. Firstly, using Bijan's word, cacophonous form of toleration. Living civilly with those with whom one profoundly disagrees. Not confusing tolerance with consensus. Yes, being prepared to evangelize. Expecting little from the state or from general culture to support the church. Which is, despite Williams's oddities in this regard, he had a point. The church is ultimately an eschatological reality. We're not going to see a perfect church this side of glory. But I think that form of toleration has something, indeed, much to commend it. It enables us to live robustly in an age when we are one voice among many, not the voice anymore that speaks from a privileged position. There's no reason why Christians should assume we have that position. And secondly, he does remind us of the possibilities of living in times when ideas are up for grabs. Let the word of the Lord run freely.
Thank you very much, Mostyn. You've given us a very great deal to think about and chew on. These are really important issues, are they not? And still relevant to us today, 350 years later. We've got some time for questions, a little bit of discussion. Is there anything that anybody would like to kick off with? Let me just ask a provocative question, Mostyn. Are you saying that we should give up writing to our MPs about proposed legislation, cease to support the Christian Institute, and just get on with the work of preaching the gospel? Is that what you're saying?
No, because I don't think that's what Williams did. I mean, he was one who was up to his elbows in politics, in local issues and local events, and I think not sort of no. I wouldn't say we sort of withdraw from that kind of thing, political activity at all. I think we do it from a different perspective. I think there are some things we wouldn't do. I think the idea of trying to I know people won't agree with this. Some people won't agree with it. I think we're trying to propping up a Christian culture, the establishment. I think we shouldn't be doing it. And I think as Baptists, really, where are we? You know, I do think Williams brings us back to that separatism, which is a strong part of our beliefs. But involved in politics, as I say, people who are one voice amongst many, making our voices known and doing so as we can. But you know, I think also doing it for others. I think there's a danger in we do it because, you know, we do it to prop up the Christian cause. You know, we do it to make life better for the church. Sometimes, I know that's not always true. I think if we are doing these things with a view to the benefit of a community as a whole, I think that would be more.
Can I press you on what you mean by propping up the Christian culture? Can you give us some examples of what would that be, and what should we not do in order to avoid that?
I don't think we should be, I mean, a few years ago, for example, I don't think we should be interested in whether prayers are said before a Christian council meeting, for example. I don't think we should be that worried about whether there are Christian assemblies or not in schools. I don't think we should be worried about whether King Charles III, if he becomes king, has a Christian coronation or not. So,
does that raise any questions?
I'm going to make a quick run for it.
Stephen, could you just, when we ask a question, just stand up, say who you are, where you're from, that would be helpful.
Stephen Dunning from Mostyn, North Wales. You said that he wouldn't accept the Quakers refusing to do military service because of their conscience.
Yeah.
Applying that principle to today would seem to be problematical. It would mean that a Christian registrar couldn't refuse to do a gay marriage, or a Christian doctor couldn't refuse to do an abortion. Would you care to comment?
Use the microphone.
Yeah, I don't. The issue of the Quakers was, and we think they're Quakers. I have to say that it could have been others, but the assumption is there would be Quakers who would have objected to doing military service. It would have been regarded as a conscientious objection, and Williams would say, well, for civil needs of the state. So either you say it's inconsistent, or you say, well, actually there are legitimately times when you can overrule people's consciences. In terms of the registrar, it's difficult to say. I think if you are employed as an officer of the state, you have a duty to obey. Now, it may be a matter of negotiation whether you can arrange conscience clauses. I'm not sure that would be something I would say that you could get out of. I'm not sure. The abortion was a very emotive one, and I certainly wouldn't. If I were a doctor, I wouldn't want to sort of have to be in that position. I think one would say, whether you would have a conscience clause or not, I'm not too sure on that. I think one would need to. You could follow Williams either way. You could go for complete liberty of conscience on that one, or you could follow his exception when he sort of saw certain things were necessary for the benefit of the state.
But the problem becomes who decides what's necessary for the benefit
Yeah.
of the state. I mean, there's no moral underpinning to that state.
No. But I
You're going to say something on this, Bill, on this subject?
So was it rather easier for Williams than for us? Because as you say, he was a strong proponent of natural law. In practice, although he was saying that there was no religious basis for the state, in fact, the whole society was born out of a Christian culture. So the second table of the law would have been simply taken for granted.
Yeah.
So it's what Peter Leithart would describe as middle grace, really.
Yeah.
Whereas what we're living in today is such a complete abandonment that even the second table of the law and issues like gender, sex, marriage, murder, all of those are up for grabs, as it were. So it's actually more difficult. I think at some point we have to say, well, there's two issues. One, we have to obey God rather than men.
Mm-hmm.
So that actually, yes, you might have a conscience and be sent to prison for it. But actually, two, you might say, well, actually society cannot function unless the second table of the law is respected, because those elements are so fundamental.
He in his writings he does draw on other societies. He goes back to pre-Christian societies and he says, for example, now how accurate his history was is difficult to tell, but he was aware of that argument and said, I am not just talking, and particularly he pointed to the Native Americans. He said they've got a very strong codes of civility and courtesy and kindness and humanity. He said, I hate their religion. He would never attend their religious ceremonies because he said they were devil worship. But he had a great respect for their common humanity, as he called it. So he was aware of that. And I think he would still say, well, actually, no, there's enough of that second table of the law, at least, written in human nature to make society, without Christianity, viable.
Did he address cannibalistic societies in that context?
He'd have probably said that was uncivil.
But it's difficult, isn't it? It is difficult.
Yeah, but he did. But he did address polygamy,
right,
and said, well, okay, there are some societies that have polygamy, but at least it's marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So he was prepared to go that far and say we've got sort of.
Spencer, do you have a question?
To ask,
Could you just tell us who you are?
Spencer Keller from Finchley in North London. Could you say a bit more about how he addressed the issue of tolerating people who were completely intolerant back
Yes. Trying to think.
Can you use the mic?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm big one. Trying to think of examples. I think he might have said the Quakers, in a sense, because he regarded the Quakers as very intolerant. And he debated with them, and I don't suppose he was very successful. I don't suppose either side tends to listen to the other's argument. So I think he would have said, and the reason he said they were intolerant was because that their authority was always what God has just said to me. You know, this kind of Gnosticism. So he would have said they were very intolerant. I don't know that he had experience of large groups. There were people who were very difficult to deal with. I'd be interested to see if Taming Dragons might have something to say. John Benton's book. Very difficult to deal with, who were deceptive, who were dishonest, trying to break up the Rhode Island, trying to steal land for themselves. He went on for decades fighting these people, and he just sort of plugged away at it and just kept going. I mean, don't forget that to his perspective, the people who had thrown him out of Boston were intolerant. And he just said, well, you've got to keep... He maintained very cordial relationships with people like John Winthrop for many years, and certainly Winthrop's son. But he just completely disagreed with...
I think the situation we face, say, in some countries now where Islam becomes dominant, and how you balance toleration towards, say, Islam.
It's a huge
situation where you might end up in a situation where Islam majority then becomes completely intolerant of any other view.
Yeah.
And that's a tricky balance, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I suppose he would have first have said you've got to persuade. I mean, don't forget the separation of church and state, which and liberty, those are probably the biggest things that Islam finds difficult. But then so did Christendom. It wasn't until Roger Williams and later that even Christians were actually accepting separation of church and state and freedom of conscience. Now, I know you could say there's a theological basis for those things in Christianity which doesn't exist in Islam, and I'm conscious of that. So I think we seek to persuade, and we seek to argue, and we don't run away from the argument. But it's a very difficult one because we're living in a culture where the establishment is hiding an awful lot from us. The government, they don't let us know a lot of what's going on in terms of the impact and the influence of Islam in our country. But it's very interesting that Islam... it was reckoned that there were more Muslims than Jews in London in the middle of the 17th century. And Williams himself said he had contact with Turks, as he called them. And the Levant Company, which had been formed under Elizabeth I, had up to 40,000 employees at the accession of James I. And both Cambridge and Oxford had chairs of Arabic in the 1630s. And the first translation of the Bible into Quran, the first translation of the Quran into English was in 1649. So there would have been quite a lot more, access to Muslims and Islam than perhaps we are aware of today, but not the kind of Islamic problems that we are facing, certainly.
Good. Thank you very much indeed, Mostyn. I'm sure that's whetted our appetite for the book and to consider these matters further as we talk amongst ourselves. We've got one more song to sing.